What would you bury in a velvet-lined box no one was meant to open? Welcome to Crimson Ledger. I am your host, Samuel Bramwell. Which part of the world are you listening to tonight? Your comments always make the mystery feel more alive. Let's uncover it. It was the sort of late spring day that might have stepped straight out of a watercolor, a day warm enough to invite linen hats and lemonade, but not so sultry as to wilt the roses or deter the vicar from fussing about the bunting. The annual garden fete at Finchmere Green was in full swing, with sponge cakes, jam stalls, and whist tables fanned out across the lawn like a parade of domestic virtue. A brass band from Little Hembury played valiantly near the croquet hoops, though the trumpet had gone slightly flat during the second waltz. Miss Marple, seated beneath a striped parasol beside the tombola, was delicately embroidering a modest handkerchief with pale blue thread. Her pale eyes, sharp as ever behind their genteel cloudiness, flicked about the crowd in quiet amusement. Her needles moved, but her attention wandered far from the fabric. Miss Marple never came to these events merely for the lemon curd. "I do believe Mrs. Withers has poured a splash too much into her summer punch," murmured Mrs. Armitage, a stately figure in lavender. She leaned in conspiratorially, and Miss Marple offered a faint smile without looking up. "In my experience," she replied mildly, "Mrs. Withers' generosity increases in direct proportion to the number of unmarried gentlemen present." The two women shared a polite chuckle. In a corner near the raffle table, the Reverend Pritchard was attempting to disentangle the twins from a length of bunting, while Mr. Henry Bloxham, manager of the local branch of South Midland Bank, stood fidgeting beside the prize tray. A wicker basket filled with homemade preserves, a box of mint humbugs, and a new pound note sat atop a lace doily. The note, crisp, blue-edged, and oddly regal in its starkness, was meant to draw eager ticket buyers. Mr. Bloxham did not usually volunteer at such events, but today he had made a point of announcing the note's authenticity to several ladies of the congregation, a few of whom pretended they'd never seen a pound before. "Issued fresh from the vault this very morning," he'd boasted with a rather artificial laugh. "Serial number and all, quite a novelty, really. No fingerprints but mine." By 4 o'clock, the raffle began. Miss Marple accepted a glass of lemonade and folded her handkerchief with methodical care. The air buzzed with idle chatter, laughter, and the clink of teacups. The winning number was drawn and announced by the vicar's wife, and the basket, minus the note, was passed to the lucky recipient. A brief flurry of confusion followed. "But the pound note," stammered Miss Giles, peering into the wicker. "It's not here." I put it there myself," said Mr. Bloxham, his brow suddenly damp. "Folded it neatly. In the side pocket. It must have... well, it can't have gone far." The crowd began to hum with the low thrum of speculation. Several people offered to look under tables and peek beneath serviette trays. A few chuckled, assuming it had blown away. Yet the atmosphere, until now harmless and warm, shifted with a subtle chill. By 4:30, the note had not been found. Mrs. Withers tittered something about mischief and fairies. The vicar assured everyone that the matter would be handled discreetly. But Mr. Bloxham had gone rather pale. "I suppose," said Miss Marple gently, mostly to herself, "that it must have been mislaid." She sipped her lemonade and watched as the various guests scattered across the lawn, each now slightly more cautious in their movements. What began as a trifling mix-up over a raffle prize had acquired the faint but unmistakable scent of something more serious. Later that evening, as twilight settled over Finchmere like a worn quilt, a police constable cycled up to the vicarage. Not for the lost pound note, precisely. For the man who had provided it. Mr. Bloxham had been found collapsed in his office at the bank, quite dead. A teacup lay shattered beside his desk. The safe behind him hung ajar. And as the news broke the next morning, there was one small fact that kept circulating in whispers between neighbors behind hedges, over teapots. The missing pound note had never been recovered. Miss Marple, for her part, began her morning with toast, honey, and a curious silence. She did not mention Mr. Bloxam's name aloud, but she read the article in the Finchmere Gazette twice. Then she laid down her breakfast knife and softly said, "There's something very peculiar indeed about that banknote." Finchmere, that well-pruned corner of the English countryside where life ordinarily moved no faster than a milk cart on a misty morning, found itself quietly upended. By noon the day after the garden fete, talk of Mr. Bloxam's untimely death had woven itself into the very hedgerows. Housewives in gingham aprons paused at their washing lines to confer with neighbours. The village grocer dropped hints between weighing out sugar and weighing motives, and even the paper boy lingered longer at garden gates, eager to exchange tidbits overheard from the constable's bicycle radio. In the buttercup tea-room, where the floral wallpaper curled at the edges and the Victoria sponge was renowned, Mrs. Armitage was already 3 theories deep. She stirred her tea with more force than usual, her brooch of Saint, George and the Dragon glinting in the sunlight. It was heart failure, she declared confidently, though no such cause had yet been confirmed. You know what a worrier Henry Bloxam was. All those bank columns and ledger pages. No doubt the missing pound note gave him such a fright, he dropped dead on the spot. Mrs. Linton, who ran the charity shop and claimed she had once met Noel, coward, leaned in. "Then why the open safe?" she asked with a raised brow. "My Arnold says there were bank papers all over the floor, scattered like confetti. Doesn't sound like a man tidying up before his ticker gave out." "Well," said Mrs. Armitage, undeterred, "perhaps he was in the middle of something. You know how fussy he was about procedure. I still say it was natural causes." Miss Hartley, the schoolmistress with unusually keen hearing, piped up from the next table without turning around. "If it were natural, the police wouldn't be questioning every teller who ever handed out a 10-shilling note." Down the lane at the post office, Mrs. Finch was recounting for the 3rd time that morning how she'd seen a figure slipping into the alley beside the bank around dusk the previous day. Could have been a cat, could have been a man, but it had a furtive step, I tell you. Furtive. Her husband muttered something about her needing new spectacles, but nobody really listened. The Reverend Pritchard, who had taken to visiting parishioners more often since the incident, made his rounds with a folded prayer book in one hand and a keen eye for reactions. He spoke to Mrs. Dalrymple, who had drawn the winning raffle ticket and now seemed deeply unsettled by the whole business. "It's a strange feeling, Vicar," she whispered, "winning something and then finding out the prize vanished, and the donor with it. I'm beginning to wish I hadn't entered at all." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had made no pronouncements. She had simply returned from morning errands, paused in her hallway to remove her gloves, and written 2 names in her small notebook, Mrs. Dalrymple and Mrs. Finch. As was her habit, she spent the late morning pruning her geraniums, her soft humming barely audible over the distant peal of church bells. But behind her pale blue eyes lay quiet thoughts arranging themselves with remarkable order. She had lived long enough to know that public speculation usually ran in one direction, while the truth slipped off in another. And she knew too well the difference between real grief and performative confusion. The bank manager had not been loved, nor had he been loathed. He had simply been present, which made his death both more curious and more threatening, for a man without enemies is sometimes the most dangerous sort of victim. It was just after luncheon when Miss Marple received her first visitor of the day. Sergeant Tom Ellis arrived with a hesitant knock and an apologetic stance. He was a solid young man with muddy boots and a brow furrowed by the responsibilities of a village too small for scandal. "Miss Marple," he began, accepting the chair she offered in the parlor. "I imagine you've already heard." "I have, Sergeant," she replied calmly, "though I imagine I've heard less than others think they know." He gave a weary smile. "That's about right. It's a fine mess. The safe was open, but only the day's takings and 1 deposit slip seemed to be gone. No forced entry. No sign of poison in the teacup either. At least, not yet. "Ah," said Miss Marple, lifting a teapot lid and pouring for them both. But no traces of anything out of the ordinary, of course, could also be quite revealing. Ellis gave her a long look. "That's the thing, isn't it? There's no note, no letter, no sign of distress. Just that look on his face. Not panic, mind you, more like surprise." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Surprise, you say? As if he'd realized something a moment too late, or seen someone he didn't expect." She murmured. "Tell me, Sergeant, was the pound note ever found?" "No, ma'am. That's what started the whole kerfuffle, and it's still missing. Not in the waste bin, not in the drawers. Some folks think it's nothing, just misplaced, but others are starting to wonder if it was bait for something larger." "Something larger," repeated Miss Marple softly, tapping her teaspoon once against the rim. "It's always the smallest things that conceal the most telling truths." Sergeant Ellis blinked. "That's a fine phrase, that." "It's not mine," she said absently. "An old schoolmistress of mine used to say it whenever a girl accused another of something and couldn't provide proper evidence. 'Look to the smallest thing, girls,' she'd say. 'A loose ribbon, a scuffed shoe, a wrinkle in a letter. Truth has a habit of leaving its petticoat showing.'" The sergeant chuckled, then stood. "I'll keep it in mind, ma'am. Thank you for the tea." After he left, Miss Marple sat in the quiet. Outside, the village clock struck 2. From her sewing basket, she drew out her small notebook again and, with her fountain pen, added 2 more names. Then, beneath all 4, she wrote a single word: motive. She replaced the notebook with care. There was something odd, she thought, about the banknote never being found. Too odd for coincidence. And something very peculiar indeed about a man dying in surprise. Something, or someone, had upset the balance of Finchmere's polite little world, and she, Jane Marple, intended to set it right. By the time the week turned, the scent of scandal had settled upon Finchmere like the faintly acrid smell of overripe apples in a wicker basket. Hard to ignore, difficult to explain, and clinging stubbornly to everything it touched. The village carried on, as it always did, with its routines and rituals, but now with an added layer of caution in the air. Smiles grew thinner. Conversations at the grocer's were shorter, and everywhere, at the greengrocer's, the ironmonger's, and the footpath through Upper Mead, there was one shared, silent question: who would die next? Not that anyone said it aloud, of course. This was Finchmere, after all. Death might knock on the door, but it would still be offered a cup of tea before any real fuss was made. Miss Marple, ever discreet, had no interest in gossip for its own sake. But she did believe in people, and people, when unnerved, had a way of revealing their truths in the most mundane settings. That was why she found herself, quite innocently, at the charity shop 2 days after Sergeant Ellis's visit, sorting through a pile of second-hand linen under the polite eye of Mrs. Linton. "I don't suppose," Miss Marple said casually, fingers brushing a yellowed napkin, "that you ever see old banknotes among the donations?" Mrs. Linton laughed. Too quickly, perhaps. "Heavens, no. Only old love letters and the odd ration coupon. People these days barely keep receipts, let alone currency." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I remember when my late nephew Raymond tried to impress a girl by pressing a £5 note into a poetry book. It was returned to him with a note: 'Too commercial. Try violets next time.' Rather shattered his literary aspirations." Mrs. Linton gave a tight chuckle but said no more. Her hands were unusually still on the cash box. Outside, Miss Marple took a slow walk up the high street. She greeted the postmistress, made a point of buying a single orange from the market stall, even though she already had 3 at home, and then paused by the public notice board where someone had pinned a flyer for a missing cat and, curiously, a torn corner of an envelope bearing the bank's insignia. She plucked it off discreetly, examined it, and tucked it away. At the far end of the street stood the bank itself, South Midland Finchmere Branch. Its windows were shuttered for investigation, and its entrance was cordoned with modest police tape that looked more apologetic than accusatory. Yet the building seemed to loom larger than usual, as if daring anyone to admit how much they had relied upon Mr. Bloxam's discreet efficiency. Inside, of course, there had been whispers of discontent even before the fete. Several accounts had been quietly closed, and Miss Marple recalled a conversation in the tea-room some weeks prior about new management from Birmingham and pressure from the top. Still, nothing that would suggest murder, unless someone feared discovery. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a call to Mrs. Dalrymple, the unwitting recipient of the prize basket. The elderly widow received her with visible relief and a tin of stale short bread, served in trembling hands. "Oh, Miss Marple, I must admit it's been quite dreadful. I can't sleep. I feel as though I'm somehow connected to it, don't you see?" Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Guilt by association can be a frightful thing, even when we've done nothing wrong. It's a weight people often carry alone, though they needn't. "I wish I hadn't taken that basket," Mrs. Dalrymple muttered. "It seemed such fun, and now people glance at me in the bakery as though I'd pinched something." "Did you notice anything unusual about the basket?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Anything odd in the lining, or perhaps an item that didn't belong?" Mrs. Dalrymple frowned. "There was a bottle of damson jam with a smudged label, but I assumed it was Mrs. Elcott's work. She always writes in a dreadful scrawl, and a sachet of lavender that smelled like mothballs. I threw that away." Miss Marple nodded, storing away the detail. "You know, people often use lavender to mask other scents. It was once common in theatre dressing rooms to hide the smell of grease paint. Quite clever in its way." "Do you think," Mrs. Dalrymple asked in a hush, "that someone used the basket to hide something?" Miss Marple merely gave a small smile. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, dear. Sometimes a jam jar is just a jam jar." After taking her leave, she turned instead to a far more elusive source. Young David Purley, the under-gardener at the vicarage and part-time errand runner for the post office. He was sweeping the church path when she arrived, whistling something tuneless. "Good morning, David," Miss Marple called. He blinked, startled, and quickly removed his cap. "Morning, miss. I wondered if you happened to be at the fate raffle table when the prize was drawn." David nodded. "I was helping Mr. Bloxam set things up earlier. He was very particular, folded that pound note like it was a crown jewel, told me to keep my hands in my pockets. And after the draw, I'd gone to fetch more lemonade, ma'am. When I got back, the note was gone. I thought it odd, but I figured someone had pocketed it for safekeeping." "Did you see anyone near the basket after Mr. Bloxam?" David hesitated, frowning. Maybe Mr. Timpson. He was leaning over, pointing at the humbugs. Could have brushed the side. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Mr. Timpson, the tobacconist." "Yes, ma'am. Always smelling of clove oil and always talking about how little respect he gets since the price of cigarettes went up." As she thanked the boy and turned toward home, her mind was whirring. The pound note wasn't the crime. It was the symbol, the match that lit a very dry fuse. And somewhere amid the damson jam, the dusty lavender, and the clove-scented grievances, someone had decided that Mr. Bloxam was a danger that could no longer be tolerated. But what had he seen? What had he said, or not said, that had made someone kill? That evening, Miss Marple sat with her notebook again. Underneath the word motive, she now wrote, bank records, lavender, Timson, envelopes. She underlined Timson twice. The banknote might never have been meant to be found, but perhaps it had already done what it was meant to do: unsettle, distract, conceal. The real crime was likely much older than the fate itself, and Miss Marple, in her soft-spoken way, intended to reach back far, enough to uncover it. The curious thing about Finchmere, as Miss Marple had often reflected, was that the village never appeared to change, and yet beneath its familiar hedgerows and painted gateposts, people could turn with alarming swiftness when trouble brushed their doorstep. The initial shock of Mr. Bloxam's sudden demise had now fermented into the more corrosive spirit of suspicion. This was clearest at the King's Head, the village's only public house, where on Thursday evening a small assembly of men had gathered in the snug to deliberate, with pint glasses in hand and narrowed eyes, the curious business of the missing banknote and the banker's death. "I'm not saying I know anything," muttered Mr. Elcott, a retired solicitor who always gave the impression he'd once tried a case at the Old Bailey. He hadn't. "But it strikes me as too tidy by half. A pound note vanishes, and so does the man who vouched for it. Smacks of guilt, doesn't it?" "Guilt, or someone trying to make it look that way," countered Mr. Jonas, the station master. "Henry wasn't the sort to misplace a halfpenny, let alone a pound." "Unless he had reason to," said a third voice, thin, pinched, and scented faintly with pipe smoke. The men turned. Mr. Timson, tobacconist and a part-time conspiracist, was polishing his spectacles with a handkerchief that bore faint brown streaks. His habit of using the same cloth for glasses and fingers made his appearance perpetually smudged. "What reason?" Jonas challenged. Timson shrugged with studied vagueness. "Let's just say the bank's been whispering about some discrepancies. Nothing printed, mind you, but my cousin up in Bledlow's got a friend in the audit office, heard Mr. Bloxam was due for review." The word review carried the same weight as scandal in Finchmere. By the time the last bell rang, Mr. Timson's suggestion had bloomed into a full-fledged theory. Mr. Bloxam had been discovered juggling accounts and had taken the only escape available to him. By morning, Sergeant Ellis had been reluctantly obliged to call Mr. Timson in for questioning. Miss Marple learned of this, of course, while collecting rhubarb from Mrs. Hartley's allotment garden. The school mistress, who knew everything 2 hours before it reached the Gazette, passed the news along with 2 stalks and a whisper. "They say he got prickly when asked about the feet," she confided. "Raised his voice and refused to sit down, and you know how Sergeant Ellis hates it when people won't sit down." That same afternoon, Miss Marple walked past the tobacconist's shop, which now bore a hand-lettered sign, "Closed for stocktake." She paused briefly, noting the shutters drawn and the faint smell of stale clove oil that clung to the doorway. Later, she paid a visit to Reverend Pritchard, ostensibly to discuss hymn selections for the Sunday service. Over tea in the vicarage, drawing room, the subject, as expected, turned inevitably to Mr. Timson. "Odd man," the Reverend said, brushing crumbs from his cassock. "Devoted to his trade, though I've always felt he kept his eyes on people more than on his product." "Did he attend services regularly?" Miss Marple asked. "Most Sundays, yes. Sat near the back. Took communion with hesitation. Said he didn't like handling the silver. Claimed it gave him a rash." Miss Marple smiled politely but said nothing. She had seen Mr. Timson accept change from a polished sugar bowl at the tea-room with no apparent irritation. "There was a little incident 2 months ago," the Reverend added hesitantly. "A missing collection envelope. It turned up behind the hymnals the following week. Nothing was stolen, but the timing was odd." "Did Mr. Bloxam know?" "I believe I mentioned it to him when he visited the church accounts," said the Reverend. "He looked quite grave, said he'd seen similar misplacements before and not to be too quick to assume innocence or guilt." Miss Marple's teacup paused mid-air. How very insightful of him. She returned home just before dusk, where a folded note awaited her on the hall table. Slipped through the letterbox, unsigned. It read, in a faint but steady hand, "Don't trust the tobacconist. He wasn't at the fete when he said he was." Miss Marple read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it beneath the lid of her biscuit tin. The next morning, she walked once more to the bank, now being reopened for limited business by a temporary clerk from the South Midland branch in Basingstoke. Miss Marple, using the polite pretense of inquiring after a friend's safety deposit box, was granted a brief entry. The clerk, a polite but preoccupied young woman named Miss Greaves was flustered and unfamiliar with Finchmere's rhythms. Miss Marple asked only a few questions but noted two things. The safe now bore a fresh combination lock, and the previous ledger, a handwritten volume, had been removed from the shelf and boxed for central auditing. After thanking Miss Greaves, she lingered in the front corridor, peering absently at the framed photograph of the branch's staff taken the previous year. There was Mr. Bloxham, standing stiffly beside a younger man she did not recognize. The plaque beneath the frame read, "Staff of South Midland Finchmere Branch, 1952. Miss Marple frowned. The younger man had fair hair, a narrow face, and eyes that seemed to be looking away from the camera. Something about him tugged at a thread in her memory. As she turned to leave, she passed the small desk near the foyer, where visitors would write their business. The blotting paper had recently been changed, but beneath it was a faint impression, as though someone had written firmly and torn off the top sheet. Miss Marple, feigning a stumble, pressed her knitting bag down on the desk and palmed the blotter. At home, she shaded the back of it gently with a pencil. The words that emerged were smudged, incomplete but legible. Not safe. She suspects. Must delay the visit until I'm sure it's burned. She stared at it for a long moment, then whispered softly, "Well now, that's not something one usually finds near a deposit counter." A name emerged from the edges of her thoughts, sharpening. The man in the photograph. The faint outline in the message. The sachet of lavender. The suspects were now shifting into shape. Mr. Timpson might have had smoke on his fingers, but it was someone else who had tried to burn away the past, and Miss Marple had no intention of letting it remain in ashes. On Saturday morning, the church bells of Finchmere rang a touch too brightly, as if eager to cast a note of normalcy over a village that felt anything but. Children skipped along the lane, baskets of gooseberries in hand, while a soft breeze stirred the hedges that lined the vicarage garden. The usual rhythm of things resumed, on the surface. But there was something unnatural in the calm, the way eyes darted a little too quickly and conversations dropped a little too soon. Miss Marple, for her part, was not idle. Her knitting remained untouched that morning, left in a neat circle on her parlor armchair while she prepared for a visit that had been forming in her mind since the moment she read the faint graphite message on the bank blotter. She did not go to the police. Not yet. Experience had taught her that the subtleties of village life often escaped official attention. What looked like coincidence was usually designed. What seemed irrelevant, like a sachet of lavender or a scrawled note, was often the spine of the whole matter. And what could seem more irrelevant than a bonnet? It had been on her mind since the fete. The large straw garden hat worn by Mrs. Withers, laced with faded blue ribbons and a garish pink silk flower that bobbed at an uncertain angle. Miss Marple remembered seeing it as clearly as if it had been painted. Mrs. Withers bustling near the tombola table, hands full of punch cups, bending down just as the raffle prize was being handed off. A moment easily missed. It wasn't the bonnet itself that troubled her. It was what it had obscured. With her parasol and handbag in tow, Miss Marple took the familiar gravel path to Rose Cottage, where Mrs. Withers lived in a cheerful tangle of flowering vines and aggressively cheerful wallpaper. "Oh, Miss Marple!" Mrs. Withers cried as she opened the door, cheeks already flushed from heat or gin. "Do come in. You must try my new currant biscuits, though I'm afraid they turned out a bit enthusiastic." Inside, Miss Marple accepted the biscuit with a smile and sipped at her tea while her hostess chattered. "It's a terrible business, isn't it?" Mrs. Withers clucked. "Poor Mr. Bloxham. I've always said the banking profession breeds ulcers." All that, sitting and secrecy. Though between you and me, I never liked the way he looked at you. Too cold, like he was sizing you up for a receipt. "I never noticed," said Miss Marple softly. "But I did wonder. At the fete, you were near the raffle table just before the basket went missing. Were you not?" Mrs. Withers blinked. "Me? Oh, heavens, yes, but I was just helping tidy the cups. Someone had knocked over the lemonade jug. Yes, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, and you bent down at just the right angle to block the view for nearly everyone behind you. Well, I hadn't thought of it that way, said Mrs. Withers, blinking rapidly. But I don't know anything about the missing money, dear. Miss Marple set down her cup. I didn't say you did, but I did notice something else. A corner of your ribbon, pale blue, wasn't it? Looked rather discolored. Mrs. Withers flushed. That's from the punch, I'm sure. Someone sloshed a bit on me, and I tried to dab it with lavender water, an old habit from my mother. Lavender water, Miss Marple echoed, eyes narrowing slightly. I imagine that would mix rather oddly with bank ink. I beg your pardon? Some notes, Miss Marple continued gently, are marked with an invisible substance to track handling, particularly when a bank fears internal theft. When touched by lavender oil, the substance discolors fabric within minutes. The edges turn grey-green, almost imperceptibly. But they don't wash out. Mrs. Withers opened her mouth, then shut it. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap. I didn't take anything, she whispered. I swear on my husband's grave, I found it tucked beneath the preserves, just the edge of it, and I panicked. I thought someone had already stolen it and stashed it, and if I left it there, I'd be accused. So you? I slipped it into my basket, she admitted, folded it into a tissue packet. I meant to return it quietly later, but then, Mr. Bloxham, her voice broke off. You still have it? Mrs. Withers fumbled in her side drawer and retrieved a small floral pouch. Inside was the very pound note, now slightly crumpled but still intact. Miss Marple examined it. The serial number, she murmured. Yes, this is the note. Mrs. Withers wrung her hands. I didn't mean any harm. Please don't tell the constable. I don't think I shall, said Miss Marple gently. You may not have stolen it, but you may have seen something else while you were near that table. Mrs. Withers was quiet for a long moment. There was someone, just before I arrived. Someone bent over the basket, pretending to admire the humbugs. Slim fellow, wore a grey coat, too warm for the weather. Didn't stay long. Did you see his face? No, but I noticed he walked away oddly. Limped a little. Right foot, I think. Miss Marple filed this away. When the note was recovered, she returned home with no ceremony. But in her drawing room, she laid it on the table beside the pencil-rubbed message from the blotter. Then she removed a small envelope from her bag, one she had retrieved from the bank's wastebasket the day before. It bore a partial address and a faint scent of lavender beneath a smoky overtone. She penned a note to Sergeant Ellis requesting a quiet meeting. When he arrived that afternoon, she showed him the note, the blotter rubbing, and the envelope. I believe, she said calmly, that the missing banknote was never the crime itself. It was a signal, a trigger to provoke or distract, and the man we're after may not be from Finchmere at all. But he knew the area, perhaps from years ago. He has a limp, a reason to fear discovery, and a strong interest in destroying documents. Sergeant Ellis leaned over the table, frowning. You think Bloxham recognized him? I think Mr. Bloxham was on the verge of reporting something or someone connected to past misdeeds, and I believe our mystery man may have once worked at this very bank. Ellis sat back slowly. You mean the assistant who left in '52? The one who was dismissed quietly after some discrepancy? Miss Marple nodded. I believe he's returned, and I believe he knew something was hidden in the records. Something damning. He couldn't risk it surfacing, so he arranged a distraction. And Bloxham was too honest to be bribed and too cautious to confront him without proof. The sergeant rubbed his jaw. This is bigger than I thought. They always are, said Miss Marple, looking out the window. Murder rarely begins at the moment of death. It begins years earlier, in resentment, pride, or fear. And as the sun dipped low over Finchmere, casting long shadows through the window pane, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, knowing that the past, however neatly one tried to fold it, always left a thread hanging. It was only a matter of time before she found where it led. The following Sunday dawned over Finchmere with a deceptive brightness, casting clean golden light across the slate rooftops and neatly raked gravel drives. In the vicarage garden, bees moved industriously between foxgloves and lavender, and children in starched collars fidgeted in their Sunday best. The surface calm was impeccable, as ever. But something was stirring beneath the surface of Finchmere life. An air of tension, difficult to define, harder still to ignore, seemed to settle on the parish like a fine layer of dust over polished furniture. By midday, it became clear that the news of the recovered banknote, though not publicly announced, had somehow begun to circulate in whispers. Miss Marple, seated 2 rows behind the choir pews at St Edmund's, could sense the quiet shift in mood. Eyes flitted. Heads leaned toward neighbors under the guise of hymn-book sharing. Mrs. Armitage coughed no fewer than 5 times, each with just enough emphasis to invite attention. Outside, Miss Marple lingered beneath the yew archway, nodding politely to passers-by. She had no intention of quelling the rumors. On the contrary, a touch of communal curiosity could be a useful thing. It loosened tongues, and one tongue in particular had begun to twitch. Mr. Leonard Timson, the village tobacconist, now a figure of elevated suspicion, stood rigidly by the gate, speaking with the Reverend Pritchard in low tones. His mustache twitched nervously, and his coat, still slightly too warm for the weather, was buttoned to the neck despite the heat. Miss Marple, moving quietly as only she could, timed her approach so that their conversation paused just as she reached them. "Mr. Timson," she said sweetly, "how very good to see you in church again. I do hope the events of the week haven't kept you from your usual customers." His eyes darted, just for a moment, toward the vicar, then back to her. "I'm not one for hiding, Miss Marple," he said stiffly. "I've done nothing wrong, and if some folks think otherwise, that's their affair." "Oh, I don't doubt that for a moment," Miss Marple replied with a kind smile. "But people are such curious creatures. When something goes missing, they always look first to whoever seemed most interested in it, even when the true thief is only interested in what was near the missing item." Timson's mouth twitched. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Merely that when one watches closely enough, it's often the person pretending to look for something who most fears it being found." She let the words hang, then moved away with polite finality, leaving behind the faintest ripple of unease. That afternoon, Sergeant Ellis returned to Rose Cottage for another private word with Miss Marple. He looked older than he had the week before, more burdened, less skeptical. "I checked the old staff records," he began, "just like you suggested. The assistant who worked under Bloxham in 1952 was a man named Edgar Renfield, dismissed quietly after suspicions of account tampering, but nothing was ever proven, and he vanished before formal charges could be brought. No forwarding address, no trace." "Until now," said Miss Marple, handing him a slip of paper. "This arrived anonymously this morning." On the note, written in neat but slightly shaky block letters, were 5 words. "Renfield is not who he was." Sergeant Ellis squinted at it. "Cryptic." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but I believe it points to identity. False or assumed. Someone in Finchmere, I suspect, is not using their real name." Ellis rubbed his jaw. "So we're looking for someone with a motive to keep their past buried. Someone who would risk everything if those old records were ever reopened. And someone," Miss Marple added, "with just enough knowledge of the bank's layout to know which records to destroy and how to do it without immediate detection." Ellis looked at her sharply. "Do you have someone in mind?" "I have several," she said calmly, "but only one whose behavior doesn't fit the character he presents. I think it's time we turned our attention to the newcomer." You mean the bank's temporary clerk? Miss Greaves? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not Miss Greaves, no. Though she's dreadfully inattentive to details, I think she's merely inexperienced. I mean the man who arrived just before the fete. The one who rented the old gamekeeper's cottage. Ellis blinked. Arthur Nash. Yes. Or rather, the man calling himself Arthur Nash. Have you noticed? He claims to be retired from business in Leeds, yet he has no visitors, never goes to the post office, and pays an exact change for everything. No checks, no letters, no conversations. Ellis frowned. You think he's Renfield? I think he's someone afraid of leaving a trail. Later that day, under the pretense of charity work, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Hartley at the schoolhouse, bringing with her a basket of preserves and an innocent question or two about the fete's guest list. "Oh, that Arthur Nash fellow," said Mrs. Hartley. "Bit of an odd duck, if you ask me. He was at the fete, but didn't talk to anyone. Spent most of the afternoon standing near the prize table, staring at the basket. Gave me quite a chill." That was confirmation enough. Miss Marple left the schoolhouse with a quiet certainty humming in her bones. She did not run to the police. Instead, she returned home and wrote a letter. A very specific, very deliberate letter, addressed to Mr. Nash and delivered by hand through the slot of his cottage door. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. Some records never burn completely. "I know who you are. Come to my garden tomorrow morning. Let's talk before the police arrive." She signed it simply. J.M. That night she sat by her window, listening to the night sounds of Finchmere, a dog barking faintly, the clink of bottles from the King's Head, and the distant rustle of a bicycle chain. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was thinking very hard about what to do next, and Miss Marple, in her shawl and slippers, knew exactly how to wait. It was not confrontation that solved mysteries. It was patience. People revealed themselves not when challenged, but when cornered by their own conscience. In the morning, she would know which sort of man Arthur Nash truly was. And perhaps, just perhaps, she would finally have her answer. Morning arrived in Finchmere with a veil of soft mist clinging to the hedgerows and dampening the thatched rooftops. It was the kind of English morning that wore a quiet patience, neither hurried nor hesitant, but gently watchful, as if the village itself was waiting for someone to make a move. Miss Marple was already in her garden before the hour struck 8, trimming her lavender bush with deliberate precision. A small metal table had been set near the garden gate, adorned with a fresh linen cloth and a teapot still steaming. A second cup stood waiting. She did not glance up when she heard footsteps approaching. They were heavy but cautious, dragging just slightly on the right side, a sound she had catalogued in her mind ever since Mrs. Withers mentioned the limp at the fete. Arthur Nash, if that was his real name, entered the garden with the wary look of a man half expecting a trap. He was dressed neatly but plainly, a pressed jacket over a pale shirt, his shoes too polished for country wear. A man trying to belong. "Miss Marple," he said, doffing his cap. She gestured politely to the empty chair. "Do sit down, Mr. Nash. Or should I say, Mr. Renfield?" His mouth tightened, but he sat. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly. "You're not the village fool some take you for?" "I've never been fond of pretense," Miss Marple replied. "And Finchmere, you see, is very good at noticing the little things. You paid your baker with exact coins, never posted a single letter, and claimed to know no one, yet you knew the exact location of the old bank storage room without asking. You were at the fete, you were near the raffle table, you didn't steal the banknote, but you knew what it signified, didn't you?" Nash didn't answer. His fingers twitched at the edge of the tablecloth. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle. "Tell me, Mr. Renfield, what were you trying to burn?" He looked at her then, truly looked at her, as if debating whether to lie. "There was a file," he said at last, voice low. A record I never knew Mr. Bloxham had kept, from years ago. I thought it had all been forgotten. Buried. A record of the discrepancy? She asked. Yes. More than one, in fact. There was a ledger entry in a dormant account, a family name, a misapplied deposit. I moved it once, thinking no one would ever check, but Bloxham, he was methodical, and loyal to a fault. He kept a copy of the record books. I found out only recently. So you returned to recover it. I came back to destroy it, Nash admitted. I thought if I created a distraction, something trivial like the raffle note, it might buy me time. It wasn't meant to be serious, just enough to cause confusion. But Bloxham, he confronted me. He recognized me, said he'd already sent word to the auditors. Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. So you poisoned him? No. Nash stood suddenly, his fists clenched. I didn't kill him. I swear it. I argued with him, yes. I panicked, but when I left, he was very much alive. That was on Saturday afternoon. He wasn't found until evening. Then who did? She asked evenly. If not you, who had reason to silence Mr. Bloxham before the auditors arrived? He sat again, trembling slightly. I don't know. I assumed someone else had found out. Maybe someone else he'd kept records on, but I didn't poison him. There was silence. Miss Marple poured the tea. He was found with a broken teacup beside him, she said thoughtfully. No sign of violence. No obvious poison, but surprise on his face. Almost as though he had just recognized something or someone. Nash stared at his hands. He didn't drink the tea while I was there. He poured 2 cups, one for himself, one for me. I never touched mine. And his? He hadn't sipped it yet. We argued. Then I left. Miss Marple tapped her spoon against her saucer. You didn't mention this to the police. I couldn't. They'd have arrested me on the spot. Possibly, she admitted. But there's one problem with your story, Mr. Nash. If Bloxham hadn't touched his tea, how did the cup end up broken? Nash hesitated. I don't know. Maybe he dropped it later. Maybe someone else came in. That someone else, Miss Marple thought, had not yet shown their face. After Nash left, she remained in the garden for some time, the mist slowly lifting around her. Her thoughts turned not only to Nash, but also to the others who had moved near the crime, the gossips, the watchers, and the overlooked. At midday, she received an unexpected visitor. Miss Greaves, the temporary clerk from the Basingstoke branch, stood on her doorstep, her manner flustered, but her eyes sharper than they had been days before. I hope I'm not intruding, she said quickly. But something's been bothering me. I found something this morning beneath the filing cabinet in the storage room. Miss Marple invited her in. The young woman produced a crumpled envelope and unfolded it. Inside was a scorched scrap of paper, charred at the corners, but the center intact. It read, Deposit 3,421, withheld. Renfield. Entry duplicated in ledger. Confirm source of instruction. Linton, Miss Marple, froze. Linton, Miss Greaves nodded. I thought it was strange. I assumed it referred to the late solicitor, but perhaps not, Miss Marple murmured, rising slowly. It wasn't Mr. Renfield who had poisoned Mr. Bloxham. It was someone else, someone who had more to lose if Bloxham's records reached outside scrutiny. And now, that name, Linton, thrust another shadow across the case. Because in all the bustle of gossip and garden hats and misplaced pound notes, she had forgotten to wonder why Mrs. Linton, the seemingly harmless charity shop volunteer, had been so quick to hush the matter of the missing note, so conveniently poised to mislead. After all, the name Linton had once belonged to her husband, a solicitor. I retired suddenly, known to have handled accounts in confidence, and perhaps not retired as cleanly as he claimed. Miss Marple rose from her chair and looked out toward the lane, the mist now completely gone, the village clear and open to view. The game had changed again, and the person pulling the strings had been closer than anyone realized. The next morning was bright and clear, one of those rare Finchmere days when the sun arrived without reluctance and stayed without threat of rain. The shops opened as usual. The bells at St Edmund rang for morning prayers, and the Finchmere Gazette, folded neatly and delivered to Miss Marple's doorstep at a punctual 7:30, offered little more than notices of jumble sales and complaints about late posts. But for Miss Marple, the events of the past week were far from over. The charred document Miss Greaves had handed her the day before, the fragment connecting a withheld deposit to someone named Linton, had shifted the ground beneath the entire mystery. It was a clue not just to who might have had a motive, but who had acted to ensure Bloxham's silence. Miss Marple, as always, preferred to think of people rather than clues. Motive, yes. Means, certainly. But more than anything else, behavior. And Mrs. Linton's behavior had never quite rung true. Polite? Certainly. A pillar of the community, if one went by social functions and jam-making committees. But since Mr. Bloxham's death, Mrs. Linton had made several small, seemingly helpful statements that all shared one subtle feature. They redirected attention away from key matters. She had steered the conversation toward Mr. Timpson, suggested that the note might have simply blown away, and, at the fete, had been one of the first to exclaim, "How odd! It was just here." That was the remark Miss Marple couldn't forget. It had come too quickly, as though rehearsed. Not the words of someone genuinely surprised, but of someone trying to sound surprised. And there was another detail, so small that only someone like Miss Marple would have remembered. Mrs. Linton had claimed to have met Mr. Bloxham only once or twice, and yet during a chance comment at the tea-room days before the fete, she had mentioned that he always used violet ink in his ledgers, a detail unlikely to come from such a distant acquaintance. This was why, by mid-morning, Miss Marple found herself setting out a fresh cloth on her tea-table and composing a note. She sent it via young David Purley, who was always glad of a sixpence and a biscuit. "My dear Mrs. Linton, I wonder if you might join me for tea today at 3:30. I find myself in need of your advice about a lace pattern you mentioned last month, and I do so admire your needlework. Warmly, Jane Marple." At precisely 3:28, Mrs. Linton arrived. She was dressed in a tasteful navy dress with a hat tipped at just the right angle. Always precise, always prepared. "Dear Miss Marple," she greeted, stepping into the parlor with her usual composed smile. "It's such a pleasure, and how delightful to be asked about lace. I had no idea you were working on anything beyond that little handkerchief you always carry." Miss Marple smiled back. "Yes, well, I've been thinking of attempting a Valenciennes edging, but one must not jump into things without knowing the proper joints." They sat. Tea was poured. Biscuits were offered, and after some pleasant discussion of thread weights and bobbin tension, Miss Marple placed a folded slip of paper on the tray between them. "I wonder," she said mildly, "if you've ever seen something like this in your husband's records." Mrs. Linton lifted the paper with perfectly steady fingers. She unfolded it. Her expression did not change. "It's a bank reference, I suppose. I'm afraid I know very little about Ernest's old files." Miss Marple nodded, serene as ever. "Yes, that's what I thought. It puzzled me, you see. The name Bloxham doesn't appear in it, but your surname does. Quite clearly. And there is the matter of deposit 3,421, which, according to a surviving scrap from the bank's files, was flagged by Mr. Bloxham before his death." There was a long pause. A robin chirped just outside the window. Mrs. Linton's voice was careful. "It's possible there's another Linton. It's not an uncommon name." "No," said Miss Marple. "But most uncommon is the coincidence that a Linton should appear in the ledger just before an unexplained death, and that the only Linton in Finchmere should happen to have attended the fete, happen to be near the prize table, and happen to direct everyone's attention away from a very critical gap." Mrs. Linton reached for her tea. Her fingers were no longer quite so steady. "I was very fond of Ernest," she said. "But he wasn't perfect. There were arrangements, you understand. Things handled discreetly. Some clients needed help with matters they couldn't speak of openly. He simply ensured that everything stayed quiet. And Bloxham, he was going to undo that." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "So you feared he might mention your husband's role in the irregular deposit. He was going to turn everything upside down. It wasn't just about the money. It was about names, reputation, families with long histories. You know what this village is like. If you stir up something from 15 years ago, you might as well toss a rock into a beehive." "You tried to warn him?" "Yes. I visited him on Sunday afternoon after Mr. Nash had already gone. I told him to drop it, that no good could come of digging into the past." "And when he refused?" Mrs. Linton took a slow sip of tea. "He poured us both cups. I didn't touch mine. I only added a small quantity of powdered foxglove to his, just enough to slow his heart. It wouldn't kill him outright. It was only meant to incapacitate, give him time to reconsider, but I misjudged the dosage. When I left, he was still speaking, a bit weak perhaps, but alert." Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "And the broken cup?" "He dropped it just as I was leaving. He clutched his chest. I turned back. But he said he was fine. I wanted to believe him." There was no drama in her tone, only fatigue, a quiet resignation, like a woman who had been waiting all week for the knock on her conscience. Miss Marple set down her own cup. "Mrs. Linton, you do understand that I must share this with Sergeant Ellis?" Mrs. Linton nodded slowly. "Yes, I rather thought that would be the case when I saw the handwriting on your note." A silence followed, but not an uncomfortable one. When Sergeant Ellis arrived half an hour later, he did not need to ask questions. Mrs. Linton met him at the gate, gloved and composed. She said only, "There's tea in the parlor if you'd like it," before stepping into the back of the constable's car. And just like that, the calm of Finchmere returned, outwardly at least. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat by her window as the village settled into dusk. The street lamps flickered on, the baker's cat leapt to the stone wall, and the wind stirred the ivy along the chapel fence. In her notebook, beneath the list of names she had been keeping since the fete, she drew a simple line through one of them. Mrs. Linton. And in her quiet parlour, with the teacups washed and the fire low, Miss Marple thought not of poisons or ledgers, but of pride, of how far people would go, not for money, but for the illusion of respectability, and how, in the end, it was always the smallest thread, the soft whisper, the misplaced ink, the discoloured ribbon that unravelled the whole curtain. By Monday morning, the air in Finchmere carried a freshness peculiar to villages where something heavy had finally broken. The bell at the post office rang a little lighter. Children's footsteps were more eager on the chapel path, and even Mrs. Hartley at the schoolhouse allowed herself a longer than usual pause by the flower beds before the morning bell. But beneath this tentative return to routine, a quiet question threaded its way through conversations over marmalade toast and down the aisles of St. Edmund's. Had it really ended? Mrs. Linton's arrest had not been announced in the paper. Sergeant Ellis had been discreet, but the knowledge, as these things always do, seeped through the village like the slow spread of jam on sponge cake. Those who'd always admired her sewing remarked, with some astonishment, that she'd grown cold in recent years. Others who'd received her shortbread at Christmas now found it curiously tasteless in memory. And one or two, like Mr. Elcott, the retired solicitor, tutted self-importantly and claimed they'd suspected something odd for ages. Yet the matter was not quite closed, at least not for Miss Marple. It was late afternoon when she walked once again to the vicarage, summoned by a note from Sergeant Ellis. He met her at the front gate, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's confessed," he said, "but not everything fits." Miss Marple tilted her head. "No, Ellis produced a folded sheet of paper. It's her confession, signed, straightforward. She admits to slipping powdered foxglove into Mr. Bloxam's tea. Thought it would just make him ill. But what puzzles me is the timeline. According to the doctor's post-mortem, Bloxam didn't die of heart failure. It was an anaphylactic shock, rapid and total. His throat closed almost immediately. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. That's not consistent with foxglove. Exactly, Ellis said. There's no indication he ingested any cardiac glycosides, which means either she's lying or she wasn't the only one who paid him a visit that afternoon. Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. Then, very softly, then it wasn't just pride, it was a misdirection. She asked to visit the bank one final time. It was late in the day when she arrived, the shadow of the branch's stone cornice cutting a long diagonal over the steps. Miss Greaves, the temporary clerk, met her with a distracted nod and unlocked the side entrance. I won't be long, Miss Marple promised, and stepped inside the records room where it had all begun. Everything had been tidied. The scorched corner of the floor where someone had tried to burn records was now buffed and scrubbed, a faint mark still visible if one knew where to look. Miss Marple walked slowly past the shelves, eyes scanning each box until she found the one labeled Ledger Archive, 1951 to 53. She opened it carefully. Inside was a neat row of bound volumes, each marked in Mr. Bloxam's careful hand. But something had changed. She could feel it before she could see it. It was the faintest irregularity in the alignment of the bindings. One book stuck out slightly farther than the others, just a fraction, but enough to suggest it had been removed and replaced more than once. She took it down and leafed through the pages. Page after page of handwritten deposits and withdrawals, inked in violet. And then, a thin paper tucked between the final pages, so thin it could easily be missed. A carbon copy. A second version of the same ledger entry for deposit 3,421. But this one didn't name Ernest Linton. This one named someone else entirely. Miss Marple brought it to Sergeant Ellis that evening. He read the page 3 times before looking up. Miss Greaves, he said. Miss Marple nodded. She planted the burnt document. It wasn't the only original, just the one she left. She wanted the trail to end with Mrs. Linton. She was the one who made the copy and slipped it beneath the cabinet, Miss Marple said. And the foxglove, likely taken from Mrs. Linton's garden. You see, Miss Greaves knew everything. She worked at the Basingstoke branch, but this wasn't her first time in Finchmere. Years ago she trained here, under Mr. Bloxam, and he caught her out on a discrepancy. A small matter, but she never forgot it. Never forgive it. He prevented her promotion. Black mark on her file. She came back for revenge, Ellis murmured. Miss Marple folded her hands. It was meant to look like Mrs. Linton had a motive, and in truth, she did. But not enough for murder. Miss Greaves ensured Bloxam's tea was poisoned, not with foxglove, but with crushed nut oil, most likely from a pastry she knew he'd eat. He had a known allergy. She simply needed a way to cover it with a false confession. Ellis looked stunned. So Mrs. Linton was telling the truth. She tried to intimidate Bloxam, perhaps even sicken him, but someone else got there first. And used her as a convenient scapegoat, said Miss Marple. Miss Greaves forged the carbon copy and manipulated the timeline. She understood that people would believe the respectable widow over the temp clerk had more to hide. She simply had to lay out the breadcrumbs. The arrest came that night, quiet and unremarkable. Miss Greaves did not resist. She offered a bland smile and the simple words, "He deserved it." The village did not sleep easily that night. The idea that 2 women had, separately and unknowingly, taken steps that might have resulted in a man's death chilled even the most seasoned gossip. But by the next morning, the sky over Finchmere was clear. At her breakfast table, Miss Marple read the headline in the Gazette, "Bank Death, Dual confessions in shock twist. She set the paper down and reached for her knitting, fingers moving steadily over the familiar pattern. In the end, the truth had revealed itself not in a single outburst or dramatic confession, but in fragments, like lace threads tangled across a teacup, each one innocent on its own, but damning when woven together. And as she snipped the final yarn end, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet thought. Murder was never tidy, but the mind, if given the chance, could be. The dust settled slowly in Finchmere, as it always did. There were no loud reckonings, no public confessions scrawled across the chapel board, no great speeches or tearful apologies. Life, like ivy on stone, simply moved forward, covering what it could, remembering what it must. Miss Greaves was taken quietly from the village, her suitcase packed with the neatness of someone who had always planned for a quick departure. Sergeant Ellis had handled it with the kind of grim restraint that often came only from the country, where scandal wasn't shouted about, but rather nodded at behind closed curtains. The Gazette ran a second, more sober headline on Wednesday. Former clerk in custody over bank scandal, investigation ongoing. It was followed by a line in smaller print that read, "Sources suggest multiple actors were involved in the attempted manipulation of archival records. One suspect remains under review. The community is urged to await the official report." In simpler terms, the terms were over. But for Miss Marple, the true ending came not with the newspaper, but with the way the village began, ever so subtly, to recalibrate itself. On Thursday, the King's Head hosted its weekly card night again. Mr. Timpson returned, slightly subdued, but not disgraced. On Friday, Mrs. Withers baked a new batch of rhubarb tarts and delivered them, without being asked, to the parish council. And by Saturday, Mrs. Dalrymple had once again taken up her seat at the tea-room window, sipping Earl Grey and pretending not to glance at every passer-by. Miss Marple, meanwhile, spent her week quietly, though not idly. On Sunday morning, she visited the church earlier than usual and laid a small bouquet beneath the plaque for the late Mr. Henry Bloxham. Just 3 primroses, nothing more. He had been, in her view, a lonely man, not disliked but underappreciated, too precise for warmth, too honest for comfort. Yet in the end, he had done what so few did. He had tried to right a wrong and had paid for it with his life. She stayed a moment longer in the silence of the chapel, then turned and left without a word. Outside, Sergeant Ellis was waiting, hands behind his back. "I thought I might find you here," he said. Miss Marple gave him a smile. "I sometimes think these sorts of things don't fully settle until one has paid their respects." "I agree," Ellis said, his eyes drifting toward the stone pathway. "The report's nearly done. Bloxham's death is recorded as unlawful killing by anaphylactic shock, cause intentional poisoning. Miss Greaves will be formally charged by the week's weekend." "And Mrs. Linton?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Released," he replied, "though not without a warning. We've no proof she administered anything harmful, but her interference with the investigation was significant." Miss Marple nodded. "I imagine she'll take to her knitting for a while." He chuckled. "Or a cruise. Some do, when shame proves more unbearable than prison." There was a pause before he added, more quietly, "I've learned a great deal from watching you, Miss Marple." She looked at him with faint surprise. "Oh, I do hope not." He laughed aloud at that, then tipped his hat and turned down the path. As he disappeared from view, Miss Marple continued down the lane toward the charity shop, where she had promised Mrs. Hartley she would help fold linens for the upcoming spring jumble. Inside, the air smelled of lemon oil and old lace. Baskets of curtain fabric lined the walls, and in the corner, a tray of forgotten bric-a-brac had been arranged with suspicious neatness. "You're early," Mrs. Hartley chirped, looking up from behind a tower of crocheted doilies. "Only just," Miss Marple replied, setting her handbag neatly on the chair. I thought I'd sort through that tray of unlabeled items. Sometimes things speak louder when we've forgotten their value. As she picked up a porcelain bell with a faded blue trim, her fingers brushed against something folded beneath it. A square of paper, yellowed, stiff. It was an old raffle ticket, number 109, the winning number from the fete. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How curious," she said. Mrs. Hartley leaned over. "Oh, I thought I'd tossed all of those." "Most likely an innocent stray," said Miss Marple, slipping it into her apron pocket. "Still, it's funny how things resurface, even when we think they've vanished." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, folding and tying bundles, with the occasional comment passed back and forth about the quality of this lace or the stubbornness of that stain. Outside, a group of children passed by, chasing a hoop down the cobbled lane. Laughter rang through the air, shrill, unburdened, and clean. Finchmere was returning to itself. Later, back at her cottage, Miss Marple set the raffle ticket on the mantel beside her teacup and her carefully folded newspaper clippings. It was not evidence, not any more. Merely a thread, one among many, but a reminder that even the smallest things could spark the unraveling of a secret. She took up her knitting again, the needles clicking softly as the shadows lengthened across the drawing room. And she thought, as she often did, of how little she truly solved and how much she merely observed. The petty lies, the quiet rivalries, the desperate little schemes that people tucked away inside themselves like brittle china at the back of a cupboard. So many crimes, she had always believed, were committed not out of malice but fear. Fear of exposure, fear of consequence, fear of losing the one thing people protected more fiercely than gold, their illusion of decency. And in Finchmere, as in most places, illusions were worth far more than they ever seemed. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was David Purley, out of breath. "Letter for you, Miss Marple," he said, thrusting a plain envelope toward her. "Hand-delivered just now." She opened it slowly, her eyes narrowing as she read. Inside, one line was written in a neat, slanted hand. "You were right about everything. A." There was no return address. She folded it, tucked it into her notebook, and returned to her knitting. The village would sleep soundly tonight, but Miss Marple knew better than most. Even the neatest garden can hide tangled roots beneath its soil. And there was always another mystery, just beyond the hedge.